Hi, so I ended last week's recorded lecture by inviting you to imagine heritage and culture in much more expansive terms. At the heart of the exercise lies the paradox of this thing we call heritage. As a practice, it is principally trying to define, arrest, and document a set of cultural practices, often emerging from a desire to save it from extinction or loss. Yet when it comes to culture, given that it is a range of practice belonging to a group of people who changes according to the times, perhaps what we really need to question is what is really authentic about a particular culture? What aspect of it can we say that it's authentic? Following from this, perhaps we can also ask, how do we choose what to remember and represent as part of our understanding of a particular culture? The operative words to highlight here are to remember and to represent. Heritage works on both registers. Heritage tries to make sense of the past and uses this past to project an identity for the community in the present day. Therefore, it is commonly assumed that heritage is a work of consensual fiction about inheritance. Such a view of heritage as a collectively agreed upon set of expressed value, however, is increasingly challenged of late. Proponents of a new way of thinking about what we call heritage are coming together under the banner of critical heritage studies. And this is what we'll be touching on this week, arguing that we might instead want to think of heritage as constructed out of a series of narratives of conflict and as produced through socio-political processes reflecting society's power structures. Now, these are all very sort of like big concepts, but I think to put it very simply, over the past 10 years, what critical heritage studies have tried to do is perhaps to challenge on some level a very industry-centered sort of like language of how we talk about heritage. So very often heritage is discussed in relation to tourism, to ideas of management, to national treasures, to conservation and preservation, to public-private partnership, to audience development and foot traffic, to creating heritage lists, to how it can impact the creative economy. So in and of themselves, they are not bad issues to discuss or frame heritage in relation to. However, I think because heritage is much more than that, and because there are also different ways we can continue to sort of like frame our relationship with the past and make it meaningful, sometimes these issues tend to sort of like limit the way we understand how heritage can be meaningful, or what kind of like paradigms we can apply to understand and to change our understanding of this thing that we've inherited from the past. Now, a common term that has emerged in discussion around heritage site, for example, is this idea of placemaking, and this is what I want to focus on in this lecture. Placemaking here refers to a process that facilitates the eventual revitalization of urban or rural settlements and ecosystems that are facing impediments or decline in place, community, or livelihood. It could be due to the loss of certain enablers, unsustainable use of resources, fragmentation of communities, or loss of agency over destiny and identity. In such instances, placemaking can act as a catalyst in rebuilding social relations, improving economic opportunities, reactivating systems, or restoring environments. Creativity in such a process refers specifically to the creation or development of innovative strategies to manage and rebuild cultural citizenship, along with the social and economic infrastructure. So those are very big claims that people who do placemaking tend to sort of like put forward. And let's subject this to a bit of critical scrutiny. Some of you might have heard of Think City. It's an urban planning think tank, meaning that it does research on issues related to city planning in Malaysia, make policy recommendations to government, initiate urban regeneration projects in 3 main cities. Penang, where it started, and also Kuala Lumpur and Johor Bahru. But for the purpose of this lecture, we're going to focus on its KL, management of KL's historic center. And one thing I'd like to sort of like highlight here is the way it sort of like frames its problem statement for the research that it tries to do. So the map you see in front of you is interesting because it shows us how Think City has decided to recognize or identify a problem statement. Now, for the longest time, Think City idea of what urban regeneration is really was centered around this concept of making the historic center of KL safe again. And therefore, it initiated, for example, this survey questionnaire and focus group where it tries to sort of like identify and map out hotspots of where there is a perception coming from the public or pedestrian, people who actually walk the KL streets, where they actually feel safe and where they do not feel sort of like safe. So they have a slider that allows on their website that allows you to see the perception of safety during the day versus the perception of safety during the night. And this is the one showing the night screen, and it's visibly, when compared to the day, the perception that the city is actually quite dangerous is actually indicated by the increase in the areas that are colored red on the screen. So, but the crucial question we can ask here is, when the question of safety is sort of like framed in the study, who is the city safe for? If you were to go to KL's historic center today, it's not like it's a place that is entirely abandoned. Or at least before the pandemic, I recall very clearly it was in fact a place that continues to teem with life. And if you sort of like, you know, just walk the streets, you find that there's so many things happening on ground level. People are trading briskly, businesses is happening, people are just hanging out. It's true enough that perhaps it's a very sort of like male majority sort of like population that's using the city space. But by and large, it's also a very open space, and it's not a space that I would associate with being dangerous, for example. So in order to sort of like, you know, understand how this perception sort of like come about, perhaps we can sort of like prod the research a bit further. Now then it becomes sort of like apparent that perhaps Think City's sort of like idea of safety is very much framed alongside a very rigid idea of whose opinion matters. And the idea of who counts as a pedestrian in this case are Malaysians. They are citizens of this country who are perceived to have, who is perceived to have more rights to the space that is deemed to have been taken over by those who are not citizens of this country. So a whole sort of like cross-section of the population who actually actively use this space as a pedestrian are not engaged with. So following on the safety mapping exercise, proposals tend to then solicit ideas from designers and architects who then very often draw examples from the West and try to apply concepts and ideas of what they consider to be creative in our local context, typically involve creating the usual template kind of idea of a shopping district, because you need the commercial sort of like incentive to drive development, or the creating of the cafe culture. But very often the crucial intervention that is then added is to give it a bit of heritage inflection, to make this place give it a stylistic signature, so that it doesn't look like another European city, for example. So that's on the surface level, and not all ideas are necessarily bad. By making the city more pedestrian friendly, for example, by creating bike lanes or urban farms, or actually supporting the creation of more parks, these are all very well-meaning initiatives. But when thinking about the urban regeneration project as a whole, rather than in its parts, because those who think about it, think about all these projects are contributing ideas that they feed the idea into a larger cultural agenda that is not always entirely sort of like transparent to these cultural workers. So when we think about the larger sort of like revitalization project on the whole, it becomes highly problematic when a huge sort of like substantial segment of the urban fabric, meaning the migrant worker population, are not considered in many of the discussion. And if they're mentioned in the most cursory manner, meaning they almost become like an afterthought, let alone are they invited to participate actively in the process of co-creation of a much more accommodating and friendly place that can fulfill what Think City profess as its tagline, a city for everyone, right? So a good example can be seen in their 2018 prospectus, Collective Vision for the City, where a lot of its cultural mapping exercise are just reports of a series of programs where exotic, traditional dances are staged in public spaces, rather than actually sort of like recognizing a much more sort of like complex layer of culture that continue to sort of like exist in the city already. So while an organization like Think City can rhetorically claim that they are envisioning a city for everyone, perhaps to be critical about these claims, we need to then also sort of start paying attention to other ways in which we can perhaps frame or understand space itself. Cultural activist and arts educator Janet Pillay suggests that there are actually two approaches to placemaking. There is a top-down placemaking approach, attitude, generally conducted by urban development authorities wanting to engineer specific projects, very often in the favor of market-led property development, or in this case, on behalf of a middle-class Malaysian population who has very specific ideas of what culture is, at the expense of recognizing a whole diverse range of cultural life that is already in existence in the historic center of KL today by other cultural communities that very often we don't recognize as Malaysian enough, and therefore not part of our heritage. Now, there's a tendency also to limit local democracy and participation to favor the rapid fulfillment of an agenda. So you cut out the opportunity for more local participants to actively contribute to the process of the process of your project, in order so that what you're able to achieve, the agenda that you're trying to sort of like drive, can be more easily sort of like achieved. In such instances, placemaking is very often handled through a scientific or economic perspective, using statistics, using graphs, using charts, using expert knowledge. rather than actually sort of making a space or a platform to allow more humanistic or cultural stories uh, to emerge, privileging, more importantly, marginalized sort of like voices that are not often sort of like heard in public forum and platforms. Uh, so although when we look at the top-down sort of like approach, we often think of it as something that is objective and reliable because it uses a lot of numbers. It speaks, international language like English very fluently. Uh, uh, Very often, when you study those proposals and the plans, the solutions tend to be very generic, in the sense that they're very cookie cutter. There's no difference between the way the design works here compared to some other country in Europe or America. Uh, in this case, art is often used more as a veneer to enhance the look of a place or to create an atmosphere of cultural vitality, rather than actually sort of like a set of sort of like cultural practice that is rooted in various kind of like communities that belongs to a particular place. So when we think of art in this sense, it's often sort of like commission works, artists who don't actually belong to the community, who calls themselves professionally as artists, were then sort of like commissioned because they know the language in how to sort of like frame what they do in order to secure the commission. So in that case, then when you think about sort of like a revitalization that way, then is there a different way to think of much more local ways or much more local sort of like paradigms of thinking about how spaces can be used and what ways can that be recovered? So let's look at a more specific example that Think City was also in some ways involved in, that concerns a crucial sort of transportational and geographical uh, landmark of Kuala Lumpur, and that is the KL River. Today it looks like a drain, right? It's not a very big sort of like river system. And there are efforts to revitalize it, to make it, to recenter it at the heart of how we imagine KL sort of like history and cultural life. And so $6 billion is spent on this sort of like revitalization project. Now, a large part of it actually went to cleaning up the river, but a small, considerable sum was put aside for the beautifying of the waterfront, serving as a backdrop for KL's dramatic history that is being sort of painted and staged, in this instance, using lighting and water mist to create a very dramatic and spectacular kind of like image uh, uh, of what KL is supposed to be like. Viewing platforms were then created, and then sculptures were sort of like commissioned along the viewing platform. But at the same time, the staging of this backdrop as a historical landscape tends to really focus on ready-made paradigms that don't tell us very much about KL or nor its history. So instead, it creates a very flat, almost pictorial representation of what the city is like. That is almost divorced from the busy and lively hum that one would encounter if you were to just walk 2 minutes away from this particular location, either towards Jalan Tunku Abdul Rahman or towards Medan Pasar. Either way, KL comes alive in a very different way, as a city of migrants, of activity, of strange faces, and people from all corners of the world, uh, not just white tourists or tourists from, well-to-do countries who are arguably contributing less to the economy than the Bangladeshi worker who was brought in to build our apartments and skyscrapers, right? So in trying to sort of like find a way out of this way of thinking about heritage as that postcard picture perfect, Insta-worthy kind of like idea of how we can celebrate the cultural achievement of a city. Perhaps one useful way is to think of other more authentic local paradigms where we can think about waterfrontage. So rather than think of like, building, a shopping district along like along the riverfront, or creating another sort of like, tourist, pedestrian-friendly sort of like tourist walking route, or creating a shopping district or a cafe sort of like area that is then sort of like the closest of that area to only those who can afford to pay for that kind of like experience and the view. Perhaps we can think of, waterfront usage that might bring to mind other more democratic sort of like use of space. And I have examples, I have two examples to sort of like suggest here, one from the past and one from its contemporary sort of like usage. So on the left here, what you see is a historic photo of the Masjid Jamek. The steps that lead up to the river of Kuala Lumpur's first mosque, Masjid Jami, for example, can be reinstated. So today, for example, it's no longer sort of like visible. And it's very difficult to sort of like access the river. But in the past, where the city's river was used for the ritual of cleaning oneself before prayer, wudu, this sort of then links the intimate ritual practice of washing to the city's sort of like founding location. Even if today no one will actually do it, because the water is quite dirty, recovering the architectural sort of like space opens the space up to a very different kind of like historical experience. This is one kind of experience that actually recognizes the bodily experience and activity as crucial to how we understand a space, right? Rather than solely through the very vision-centered sort of like idea of creating a landscape. So it's details like this that will sort of like prompt us to feel a space differently, even though these are not features that we will use into this sort of like context. They nevertheless prompt us to imagine how bodies and activities can sort of like take on how different kinds of like activities work in this in this space. Okay. Another example is to share with you is that there are the street art murals lining the concrete flood walls along Kuala Lumpur's river junction. This can be seen across from the Pasar Seni or the Central Market. This is a very sort of like dynamic and active space of public co-creation. Different graffiti artists, often identifiable only by their graffiti tags. For the most part, they remain sort of like anonymous. Would often come and then sort of like paint along the sort of like flood walls of the river junction. So if we were to sort of then recognize this as a very creative use of the waterfront, river waterfront, what we have an opportunity to do is also to recognize this as a significant site for contemporary artistic public expression. In these two instances, then we get to see a much more people-centered, a much more sensitive and historically sort of like informed way of recognizing that the space itself is already being used differently and creatively by different segments of the population at different periods in KL sort of like history. And this adds to our understanding of the KL City River as being a crucial sort of like a fabric of the cultural life of the city. I'm only pointing to these two examples, but I can think of so many more, including how the river plays a central role in many of the sort of like cultural rituals connected to both Hindu and Chinese temples that would dot like the different sort of like that would sort of like that would be scattered across sort of like Kuala Lumpur. So recognizing how the river then is central to these other kinds of like cultural spaces, how they sort of like how it has this crucial sort of like function within that sort of like cultural worldview might give us a very different sense of how we can even think of the importance of the river beyond, for example, this idea that the river can only be thought of in terms of its value towards tourism management, heritage gazetted lists, or as part of a creative economy and everything, because it has a value that outlasts these things. Even when these things are no longer there, it continues to find meaning within a particular community. Okay, so that's one indication of where there are also sort of like important initiatives to challenge some of the paradigms that have been adopted in thinking about placemaking from a top-down perspective. In the next lecture, we'll look at examples from bottom-up sort of approach and connect it to ideas of cultural mapping and counter-cartographies.